They left me standing alone at the altar of betrayal. But when the venue owner whispered those three words that would change everything, I realized that sometimes the greatest empires are built in silence. The morning sun streamed through the cathedral windows of Rosewood Manor, casting golden shadows across marble floors that I had personally selected 3 years ago. My sister Emma walked past me without a glance, her ivory dress trailing behind her like a declaration of everything I supposedly was not. The venue buzzed with 200 guests, each one admiring the hand-carved archways and crystal chandeliers that represented countless sleepless nights of my hidden work. Before I share what happened that day, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are watching from. I love hearing how far this story reaches, because what unfolded changed not just my life, but how I understood the power of quiet determination. I sat in the back row, exactly where my family expected me to be. The disappointment. The one who never quite measured up to Emma's law degree or Marcus's medical practice. For 28 years, I had been the family footnote, the one they mentioned with that particular tone that said everything without saying anything at all. My mother adjusted her pearl necklace and whispered something to my aunt about how at least one of her children had made something of themselves. The words cut deeper than she intended, or maybe exactly as deep as she intended. Emma's wedding was supposed to be perfect. She had spent months planning every detail with the precision of a military operation, demanding nothing less than perfection from every vendor, every flower, every thread of lace on her dress. What she did not know was that I had been planning this day longer than she had. Not her wedding specifically, but this venue, this moment, this empire that she was celebrating inside without ever realizing who had built the walls around her happiness. The irony was thick enough to taste. Here I was, sitting in the shadows of my own creation while my family celebrated in the light. Rosewood Manor was just one of 17 venues in my portfolio, a collection of properties that stretched across 3 states and generated more revenue in a month than most people saw in a year. But to them, I was still just Sarah, the one who dropped out of business school, the one who worked odd jobs and lived in a small apartment, the one who never seemed to have her life together. Marcus walked Emma down the aisle in our father's place, his chest puffed with the pride of being the successful one, the one who saved lives and earned respect. He had spent dinner the night before talking about his latest surgical techniques, while I nodded politely and pretended not to notice how he avoided asking what I did for work these days. The assumption was always unemployment or underemployment, something suitable for the family disappointment. The ceremony began with traditional vows spoken beneath an arch of white roses and baby's breath. I watched Emma's face glow with happiness and felt the familiar mix of love and loneliness that came with being on the outside of your own family's joy. She deserved this moment. They all did. But sitting there in my simple navy dress while they celebrated in their designer clothes, I could not help but think about the conversations that had led to this day. 6 months ago, Emma had announced her engagement at Sunday dinner. The family erupted in congratulations, champagne appeared from nowhere, and plans began forming immediately. When the topic of venues came up, I had quietly suggested Rosewood Manor. Emma's eyes lit up with excitement as she described visiting the property, falling in love with its gardens and ballrooms, never once asking how I knew about such an exclusive location. The planning process had been an exercise in careful distance. I watched Emma stress about deposits and availability, about meeting with the venue coordinator and hoping everything would be perfect. I could have solved every problem with a single phone call, but that would have required explanations I was not ready to give. Instead, I listened to her worries and offered support in the only ways I could without revealing the truth that would have changed everything. What my family saw was Sarah, who never seemed to have steady employment, who drove an older car and lived modestly, who never contributed much to family conversations about careers and achievements. What they did not see were the 18-hour days I spent building something bigger than any of them had imagined. The late nights reviewing architectural plans, the early mornings meeting with contractors, the careful financial planning that had turned a small inheritance from our grandmother into an empire they never knew existed. The reception began with champagne toasts and elegant plated dinners served on china that I had personally selected. Emma looked radiant as she danced with her new husband, spinning across floors that I had refinished with my own hands during the venue's renovation. The band played from a stage I had designed, under lights I had installed, surrounded by decorations that represented months of planning with vendors who knew me by name but had signed agreements to maintain discretion about ownership. I nursed a glass of wine and watched my family celebrate, each of them comfortable in their roles, each of them secure in their understanding of who belonged where in our family hierarchy. My mother held court at the head table, describing Emma's achievements to anyone who would listen. Marcus charmed the crowd with stories from medical school. Even my younger cousin David, fresh out of college, commanded more attention than I did with his tales of landing his first job at a tech startup. The evening wore on with dancing and laughter, with speeches that praised Emma's intelligence and Marcus's dedication and my mother's strength in raising such successful children. I was mentioned once, briefly, as the family member who was still finding her way. The phrase stung with its casual dismissal, its gentle suggestion that some people just take longer to figure things out. But as the night deepened and the celebration continued, I noticed things that no one else saw. The way the venue staff moved with practiced efficiency, the seamless coordination of service, the attention to detail that made everything look effortless. This was my team, my training, my standards being executed flawlessly. Every perfect moment of Emma's wedding was a testament to work that had consumed my life for 3 years. The betrayal came during the father-daughter dance. Emma had asked Marcus to fill that role, and as they swayed to the music, my mother began crying happy tears. In that moment of family unity, I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. Not because I was not included in the dance, but because I was not included in anything. I was present but invisible, family but forgotten, necessary but unacknowledged. I stepped outside onto the terrace for air and found myself looking out over gardens that I had personally designed. The moonlight caught the fountain that I had installed, illuminated the pathway that I had planned, highlighted every detail of a landscape that represented countless hours of my vision made real. This was my sanctuary, my achievement, my proof that I was capable of creating something beautiful and lasting. That was when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Robert Sterling, the venue's general manager, approaching with a look of concern on his face. Robert was one of the few people who knew the full truth about Rosewood Manor's ownership structure. He had been my first hire, my most trusted employee, and the person who had helped me navigate the complex world of hospitality management. He stopped beside me at the terrace railing and looked out over the same gardens I had been admiring. For a moment, we stood in comfortable silence, two people who understood the weight of creating something from nothing. Finally, he spoke in a voice quiet enough that only I could hear. Robert's presence beside me felt like a lifeline in an ocean of family expectations and disappointment. He knew things about my life that no one else knew, understood sacrifices that no one else had witnessed, recognized achievements that no one else acknowledged. In his eyes, I was not the family failure or the one still finding her way. I was the architect of something remarkable. The music from inside drifted out through the open doors, mixing with the sound of fountain water and evening breeze through carefully maintained gardens. Emma's laughter carried across the terrace as she celebrated inside the empire I had built, surrounded by family who saw me as everything I was not. The contrast felt sharp enough to cut, the irony dense enough to suffocate. Robert cleared his throat softly, preparing to speak words that would change everything about this evening and everything about my relationship with my family. I could see in his expression that he understood the weight of this moment, the significance of what he was about to reveal. The general manager of Rosewood Manor was about to acknowledge, in front of witnesses, exactly who had built the empire they were all celebrating inside. I gripped the Tarak, railing and prepared for the moment when silence would finally break, when hidden truth would demand recognition, when the family disappointment would be revealed as something entirely different than anyone had imagined. Robert's words came as a gentle whisper that would echo through the rest of my life. He leaned closer to ensure only I could hear, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years of shared secrets. You built this empire, Sarah. Every arch, every garden path, every crystal chandelier hanging in that ballroom belongs to you. The recognition in his voice was something I had been starving for without even realizing it. Standing there on the terrace of my own creation, I felt the full weight of the journey that had brought me to this moment. It had started with $23,000 from Grandma Rose's inheritance, money that everyone assumed I had wasted on failed ventures and poor decisions. What they never knew was that I had taken that modest sum and turned it into the foundation of something extraordinary. 3 years ago, I had been working as an assistant event coordinator for a small catering company, watching other people's dreams come to life while my own family dismissed my work as temporary employment. Emma would ask when I was going to get a real job, Marcus would suggest I consider going back to school, and my mother would sigh whenever anyone asked what I did for work. They saw someone drifting through life without purpose or direction. But every wedding I coordinated taught me something valuable about what made events truly special. I noticed which venues created magic and which ones felt sterile, which details elevated celebrations, and which ones fell flat. I studied the business side with the intensity of someone preparing for battle, learning about profit margins and operational efficiency, while everyone assumed I was just serving cake and arranging flowers. The first property I purchased was a rundown estate outside the city that most investors had written off as too expensive to renovate. I saw possibilities where others saw problems, envisioned elegant celebrations where others saw crumbling infrastructure. For 6 months, I spent every weekend stripping wallpaper, refinishing floors, and learning skills that YouTube videos and sheer determination could teach. I remember the day I signed the purchase papers, sitting in a lawyer's office with my modest down payment and a business plan that existed mostly in my head and heart. The seller looked surprised that someone so young was taking on such a massive project. The real estate agent kept asking if I was sure I understood the scope of renovations required. But I had never been more certain of anything in my life. The renovation process was like earning a doctorate in every skill I had never known I needed. I learned plumbing when the estate's ancient pipes burst during winter. I mastered electrical work when the ballroom's lighting system failed days before my first booked event. I became an expert in historical preservation when the city required specific materials for the exterior restoration. My family assumed I was going through a phase, burning through Grandma Rose's money on some romantic notion about fixing up old houses. They made jokes about my dirty fingernails and paint-stained clothes, about how I always smelled like sawdust and cleaning supplies. Marcus suggested I hire professionals instead of trying to do everything myself. Emma worried I was wasting money I could not afford to lose. What they could not see was the vision taking shape with every tile I laid and every window I restored. The estate was becoming something magical, a place where love stories would unfold against backdrops of carefully curated beauty. I was not just renovating a building. I was creating experiences that would live in people's memories forever. The first wedding I hosted was for a couple who had been turned away by every other venue in the area because their budget was too small for the elegant celebration they dreamed of having. I offered them my newly restored estate at a price they could afford, partly because I needed the booking to prove my concept worked, and partly because I understood what it felt like to be dismissed as not quite good enough. That wedding was perfect in ways that had nothing to do with expensive decorations or elaborate menus. The couple's joy filled every corner of the estate. Their families celebrated with genuine happiness, and their love story became forever intertwined with the first chapter of my business story. I knew that first night that I had found my calling. Word spread through the wedding community about the beautiful new venue with the owner, who cared more about creating perfect moments than maximizing profit. My booking calendar filled with couples who had heard about the estate through friends, through social media posts that showed gardens in full bloom and ballrooms glowing with warm light. I reinvested every dollar of profit back into the business, purchasing additional properties and expanding my empire one carefully chosen venue at a time. Each new acquisition taught me more about the industry, about what couples truly wanted, about how to create spaces that felt both elegant and intimate. The second property was a converted barn that I transformed into a rustic chic venue perfect for couples who wanted countryside charm with modern amenities. The third was a historic mansion that required 2 years of restoration to bring it back to its original grandeur. By the fourth property, I had established partnerships with the best vendors in 3 states and built a reputation that attracted couples from hundreds of miles away. My family remained oblivious to the empire growing around them. They saw Sarah, who worked irregular hours and always seemed to be dealing with some crisis or another. They did not see the business owner who was coordinating multiple renovations, managing teams of contractors, and building relationships with vendors across the region. When I showed up to family dinners exhausted and distracted, they assumed I was struggling rather than thriving. I kept my success secret partly out of self-protection and partly out of a stubborn desire to prove something to myself before I proved it to them. I wanted to know that I could build something substantial without their encouragement or approval, that I could succeed on my own terms without the safety net of family expectations. The business grew beyond my wildest early dreams. 17 venues across 3 states, each one unique in character but unified by the same attention to detail and commitment to creating perfect moments. I employed over 200 people, from groundskeepers to event coordinators to executive chefs. My venues hosted everything from intimate elopements to elaborate celebrations with 500 guests. Financial success followed the growth of my reputation. Revenue that started in the thousands quickly grew to hundreds of thousands, then millions. I owned properties worth more than most people would see in several lifetimes, controlled a business empire that generated wealth at a pace that still sometimes surprised me. Yet I continued living modestly, driving my reliable older car, maintaining the simple apartment that my family expected me to occupy. The secret became heavier as the business grew larger. Family gatherings became exercises in careful conversation, avoiding topics that might reveal too much about how I spent my days or where my money came from. I developed elaborate explanations for why I was always traveling, always dealing with work emergencies, always unavailable for family events that conflicted with wedding seasons. Emma's engagement had presented the ultimate test of my ability to maintain the secret. When she fell in love with Rosewood Manor, I felt pride and terror in equal measure. Pride that she had chosen my flagship property for her most important day, terror that the truth might emerge before I was ready to reveal it. I had watched her stress about every detail, knowing I could solve every problem with a single conversation with Robert or any of my other managers. When she worried about the menu, I bit my tongue rather than mention that I had personally recruited the executive chef from a 5-star restaurant. When she fretted about the flowers, I stayed silent about my exclusive partnership with the region's most talented floral designers. The hardest part was listening to her describe her interactions with the venue staff, praising their professionalism and attention to detail, without realizing she was complimenting the standards I had established and the training I had provided. She would gush about how perfectly everything was being coordinated, never suspecting that the coordination was happening according to systems I had developed through years of experience. Tonight, watching her celebrate in the ballroom I had designed, surrounded by family who saw me as the one who had never quite figured things out, the weight of the secret had become almost unbearable. I was simultaneously the most successful person in the room and the most dismissed, the creator of the magical experience everyone was enjoying and the family member everyone worried about. Robert's acknowledgement on the terrace felt like the first breath after years of holding my breath. Finally, someone was seeing me clearly, recognizing the work I had done, acknowledging the empire I had built through determination and vision and countless 18-hour days. His words were preparing to change everything about this evening and everything about my family's understanding of who I really was. As we stood together looking out over gardens that represented hundreds of hours of my personal labor, I felt the moment approaching when silence would no longer be an option. The venue owner was about to reveal the truth that would shatter every assumption my family had made about my life, my capabilities, and my place in our family hierarchy. The time for hiding was ending, and the time for recognition was about to begin. Robert's presence beside me represented not just acknowledgement of my achievements, but preparation for the moment when my family would finally understand that the disappointment they had dismissed had built the empire they were celebrating inside. Everything was about to change, and there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction that had defined our relationships for so many years. Robert turned toward the ballroom doors where my family continued celebrating, unaware that their understanding of everything was about to shift forever. He straightened his shoulders with the confidence of someone who had spent 3 years watching me build something extraordinary from nothing. "Sarah," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the terrace, "it is time they knew the truth about who really built this place." Before I could respond, he was already walking toward the ballroom with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. I followed behind him, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and terror. This was the moment I had both dreaded and longed for, the revelation that would change everything about my relationship with my family. The band had just finished a song when Robert approached the microphone on the stage I had personally designed. The room fell quiet as 200 guests turned their attention to the distinguished venue manager who commanded respect through his professional presence and obvious expertise. Emma Lou, Ked radiant at the head table, her face glowing with happiness as she prepared to hear what she assumed would be another congratulatory speech about her perfect wedding day. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system I had installed and calibrated myself. "It is my honor to serve as the general manager of Rosewood Manor, and I have had the privilege of hosting hundreds of celebrations in this beautiful venue. But tonight is particularly special, not just because of the lovely couple we are celebrating, but because of someone whose story deserves to be told." I stood frozen near the entrance to the ballroom, watching my family's faces as they listened with polite attention to what they assumed would be standard venue manager remarks. My mother smiled graciously, Marcus nodded approvingly, and Emma beamed with the satisfaction of someone whose event was being publicly praised. None of them had any idea what was coming. 3 years ago, Robert continued, a young woman with extraordinary vision purchased this estate when it was nothing more than a crumbling shell of its former glory. While others saw an impossible renovation project, she saw the potential for creating magical moments like the one you're experiencing tonight. She invested not just her money, but her heart, her soul, and thousands of hours of personal labor into transforming this property into something extraordinary. The room remained respectfully quiet, but I could see family members beginning to look puzzled about why the venue manager was telling a story about some unknown person during Emma's wedding reception. My sister's expression showed mild confusion, as if she was wondering when this speech would return to focusing on her special day. That young woman worked 18-hour days, learning skills she had never needed before. Robert's voice grew stronger with conviction. She stripped wallpaper with her own hands, refinished these floors you're dancing on, personally installed the lighting that's creating this magical ambience tonight. When contractors said something was impossible, she found a way to make it happen. When experts said her timeline was unrealistic, she proved them wrong through sheer determination. My hands were trembling as I listened to Robert describe the journey I had lived but never shared. Hearing my story told to a room full of people who had never suspected the truth felt surreal, like watching someone else's life being narrated. But it was my life, my work, my empire being acknowledged for the first time in public. She didn't just restore one property, Robert continued, his eyes finding mine across the crowded ballroom. She built an empire. 17 venues across 3 states, each one a testament to her vision and dedication. She employs over 200 people, creates magical moments for couples every weekend, and has built something that generates more success in a month than most people see in years. I could see the exact moment when my family began to understand that this story was not about some anonymous entrepreneur. Marcus's eyes widened as he started doing the math of dates and details. Emma's smile faded as she began connecting the timeline Robert was describing with things she suddenly remembered about my mysterious schedule and frequent travels. But tonight, Robert's voice carried a note of pride that made my chest tight with emotion. Tonight, I want to recognize someone who has been sitting quietly in the back of this ballroom, watching her own sister celebrate in the venue she built, surrounded by family who never knew the truth about her incredible achievements. The room had gone completely silent now, 200 guests hanging on every word as they waited for the revelation that was clearly coming. I could feel every eye in the ballroom searching for the person Robert was describing, family members and friends trying to figure out who among them had been hiding such an extraordinary secret. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert said with the satisfaction of someone delivering long overdue justice, "please join me in recognizing Sarah Mitchell, the founder and owner of Rosewood Manor and 16 other venues across our region. Sarah, would you please come forward so we can properly honor the woman who built the empire we're all celebrating in tonight?" The silence that followed was deafening. 200 guests turned to stare at me as I stood near the ballroom entrance in my simple navy dress, the family disappointment who had just been revealed as the architect of their magical evening. The shock on faces throughout the room was nothing compared to the expressions on my family's faces. Emma's mouth fell open in complete disbelief, her perfect wedding makeup unable to hide the confusion and amazement that was reshaping her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her sister. Marcus looked like someone had just told him that gravity worked in reverse, his medical mind struggling to process information that contradicted years of assumptions. My mother's face went through a series of emotions so quickly that I could barely track them all. Shock, confusion, disbelief, and then something that might have been pride began to compete for dominance in her expression. She looked from me to Robert to the magnificent ballroom around us, trying to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the empire she was suddenly learning I had built. I walked slowly toward the front of the room, every step feeling like it covered miles of emotional distance. The guests began applauding as I made my way through tables of people who were witnessing a revelation that would become the story they told about this wedding for years to come. But all I could focus on were the faces of my family members as they watched me claim recognition for achievements they had never imagined I possessed. Robert met me at the edge of the dance floor and handed me the microphone with the respect of someone acknowledging his boss in front of people who had never realized the relationship existed. The weight of the microphone in my hands felt like the weight of 3 years of hidden truth finally demanding to be spoken. I looked out over the room full of people who had been celebrating in my empire without knowing it, then turned my attention to the head table where my family sat in various states of shock and amazement. Emma's wedding dress suddenly seemed like a symbol of how beautiful moments could be created by invisible hands, how joy could be built by people who never received credit for their work. "Thank you, Robert," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected it to be. "And thank you all for celebrating Emma and David's beautiful love story here tonight. This venue, and all of my venues, exist to create exactly these kinds of perfect moments where families come together to honor love and commitment." I paused, looking directly at my family as I continued. Some of you might be wondering why I never shared this part of my life before tonight. The truth is, I wanted to prove to myself that I could build something meaningful before I proved it to anyone else. I wanted to know that my success was real, substantial, and earned through my own efforts. Emma was crying now, not the happy tears of a bride, but the complicated tears of someone whose entire understanding of her family had just been revolutionized. She looked at me with an expression that held apology, admiration, and regret in equal measure. I could see her remembering every conversation where she had worried about my future, every family dinner where my career had been dismissed as temporary or insignificant. Marcus stood up from his seat at the head table, his movement causing every other person in the ballroom to focus their attention on him. For a moment, I thought he might challenge Robert's announcement or demand proof of claims that seemed too extraordinary to be true. Instead, he began clapping, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm as other guests joined in. The applause grew until it filled the ballroom with sound that felt like recognition, appreciation, and celebration all combined into one overwhelming wave of acknowledgement. I stood at the front of my own ballroom, holding a microphone in the venue I had built, finally receiving credit for work that had consumed my life for 3 years. When the applause finally subsided, I continued speaking to a room that was now hanging on my every word. Building this business taught me that the most meaningful success often happens quietly, without fanfare or public recognition. But tonight, surrounded by family and friends celebrating love, feels like the perfect moment to finally share this part of my story. My mother rose from her seat and walked toward me with tears streaming down her face. When she reached me, she pulled me into a hug that felt different from any embrace we had ever shared. This was not the careful hug of someone comforting a family disappointment, but the fierce embrace of someone recognizing achievement that had been hidden for too long. "I am so proud of you," she whispered in my ear, her voice breaking with emotion. "And I am so sorry we never saw what you were building." The apology in her voice carried the weight of 3 years of assumptions, dismissals, and missed opportunities to celebrate accomplishments that had been happening right under their noses. Emma approached next, her wedding dress rustling as she moved carefully across the dance floor. When she reached me, she took my hands in hers and looked directly into my eyes with an expression that held more love and respect than I had seen from her in years. "Sarah," she said, her voice thick with tears, "you gave me the perfect wedding in the venue you built with your own hands." The rest of the evening transformed into something entirely different from the wedding reception it had started as. Guests approached me throughout the night to express amazement at the revelation, to praise the beauty of the venue, and to ask about my other properties. Family members who had never taken my work seriously suddenly wanted to hear every detail about how I had built my empire. But the most meaningful moments were the quiet conversations with my family as they processed the complete reshaping of their understanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. Marcus apologized for every time he had suggested I needed to get my life together. Emma thanked me for creating the perfect setting for her most important day without ever taking credit or asking for recognition. As the evening wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, I found myself back on the terrace where the truth had first begun to emerge. Robert joined me there, both of us looking out over gardens that represented so much more than beautiful landscaping. They represented dreams made real, visions transformed into tangible beauty, and the power of quiet determination to create something extraordinary. "You knew this moment would come eventually," Robert said with the satisfaction of someone who had watched justice finally prevail. "I just helped it happen on the perfect night, in the perfect place, surrounded by the people who needed to hear the truth." The next morning, I woke up in my simple apartment to text messages from family members who were still processing the previous evening's revelations. Emma had sent photos from her honeymoon departure, thanking me again for the perfect wedding and asking if we could have lunch when she returned to hear more about my business journey. Marcus had texted an apology for years of assumptions and an expression of genuine admiration for what I had accomplished. My mother called that afternoon to invite me to Sunday dinner with a request that I bring photo albums and stories about my venues so the whole family could properly celebrate achievements that had been hidden for too long. The conversation felt different, marked by a respect and interest that had been absent from our relationship for years. In the weeks that followed, my relationship with my family evolved into something healthier and more honest than it had ever been before. They began referring potential clients to my venues, bragging about my success to their friends, and including my business achievements in family conversations about careers and accomplishments. The empire I had built in secret became a source of family pride rather than family concern. Emma's wedding had not just been her perfect day, but the catalyst for my family finally understanding that success comes in many forms, that quiet determination can build something more substantial than loud achievement, and that the person they had dismissed as a disappointment had actually been creating something extraordinary all along. Standing in my office at Rosewood Manor weeks later, looking out over gardens where Emma had danced on her wedding night, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful and finally receiving recognition for the work. The empire was no longer a secret. My family's respect was no longer missing, and the quiet strength that had carried me through 3 years of hidden success had finally been acknowledged by the people whose opinions mattered most. Sometimes the greatest victories are built in silence, revealed in perfect moments, and celebrated by people who finally understand that they never really knew you at all. Emma's wedding night had given me something more valuable than any business success: the recognition that I had always deserved, and the family relationships that could finally be built on truth rather than assumptions. The woman who had been dismissed as a disappointment had built an empire, and now everyone knew it.